I'm a programmer, but I just finished psychology and marketing, and I'm a kind of person who's really into human brains. I love how people think, and I love to examine that. And I believe this is the most valuable part of our job, not to do front-end tricks, but to make our users happy. And React Native is kind of a superhero in this place, but before we talk about its superpowers, we need to talk about the user experience first. What is that? Because, often there's a strong belief that user experience is something for the designers, that some guys do the interface and it's the user experience it's all about. But I will tell you a story that this is not true exactly. Here in Poland we have the application called Skycache. I have a question in here. Do we have non-Polish speakers today? You?
Satya.
Hi, Satya. If you would have... Oh, mic is working on that. Cool. If you would have to tell which part of the screen is the warning, would you be able to do that? Yeah, it's probably the orange one, right? So the application interface is quite good. And the application itself, it's a kind for payment for your travels. You can buy a ticket bus there or pay for your parking lot, etc. And it has pretty good interface, or at least color communication. But does it mean the application has good user experience? No. Because recently I was going back from my university and I had some trust into this application because I was using it for a long time. So I didn't bother myself to buy the ticket before going onto the train. And I'm going into the train and I want to buy the ticket for the train. And the application crashes and tells me that I have no internet connection despite having full LTE range. And it was a really bad situation for me because I don't have a ticket right now and the controller goes towards me and I start to sweat, oh my god, what do I do now, right? And luckily after hard kill I managed to buy the ticket, but I had a trauma right now. So there's one highlight from the story. The interface is not equal to the user experience. And our job as a programmers has a real impact on our users' lives. But why is it so important for our application to be top-notch? Well, right now there are about this many mobile apps of the world. So you are probably not the only one who creates application for, buying the clothes. You are one of about 5 million. So users have a choice and you want to do your best, right? But how do you do that? We as a programmers are like, in one big candy shop. We have a lot to choose from and it's hard to choose the technology that will be useful for you and it won't change for bad in 1 month, for example. And I chose React Native. If you could ask me personally, why did it happen? Well, this is kind of a story that I've been a web developer, familiar to React.js, and when I was recruiting myself to CallStack, someone asked me, hey, do you want to do mobile? And I said, why not? And this is what happened. But to choose React Native, there are a few more reasons that I see them from the perspective of time, First of all, it's really easy to learn. Especially if you are familiar with React.js, but actually if you are a JS developer. Comparing the React.js and React Native, it works exactly the same way, but some parts are named differently, and we have to remember about how mobile works, and all styles is made in Flex. But that's pretty much it. You feel familiar with that technology, so you have quick start. I believe after 3 months on my onboarding, I was able to do some not too bad code. And it's for lazy people, because you write one component or one feature and it works both on Android and iOS. And if you add one library, it also works on the web and it can work on the desktop too. So native programmer is a good programmer. You can focus on doing cool stuff instead of being worried about the cross-platform thing. Another one is when you really need your hardware and you are not being efficient enough in JS, you can use native. You are not limited to the JS, and it's pretty cool that you can use native when needed to. And last but not the least, the community is really big. And I believe if you use some niche technology, you know how is it when you have some problem and you have to use your library source code to find out what's the problem. In React Native, it rarely happens, and if so, here we are in Wrocław, we are called CallStack, we can help you. Yay! But doesn't it sound too awesome? I would totally lie if I told you right now that React Native has no flaws. Every technology has its pain points. But to understand them and know how to fight them, you have to know how the whole technology works on basics. It works that way. It's the most simplified version, of course, but you write your React code, and it goes through the React Native packager, and it is served to the mobile. And the application runs on two threads, JS and native. But here's the main thread. Main problem is that your application works in two realms in parallel, because you run your application in JS, and that's the place when application knows you. It's easy to be debugged, and it's know your variables. But at the same time, you need native, because you need to information about the device or gestures, etc. And the main problem is this teeny tiny red bridge between them. Communication between the threads comes in the bridge, and it happens in JSON. So it's really slow, and you can't send many data at once because it will clog. So what do you do now? Not communicate, or communicate as slow as possible. But it can be tricky sometimes because you need both of your threads. And the main challenge is navigation and animations, especially based on gestures. Why? Because they are started in JS, and they need your device, like they need to know, for example, gestures, what's happening on the screen right now, when user has its fingers. But I believe it's easy to learn something based on the real-life example. So I believe we should solve these problems right here and right now. So let's get to business. Imagine totally real-life example that such gentleman comes to you. And he wants to create a Pole store. He wants to sell dog straps, for example, because where do you buy them, right? And if any one of you have cat, do you have cats? But you know, cats have their humors, and they are really demanding creatures, and you would do your best for him to be satisfied, right? He's your customer. And it won't be easy, because the design has this fancy floating button card. Well, how do you do such button? Because, you know, it requires such animations and some gesture for it to be used. And here we have the dilemma. It's the dilemma I've talked a moment before, that you can do it in the JS mainly, or in the native mainly. This is the situation. It happens a lot in React Native, because we have a lot of libraries to choose from when you build your application. So maybe let's start with the JS approach. You can use animated, the part of React Native library, and Phantom Responder, also the part of React Native, which may sound already cool because you don't need to integrate it anymore. And it's basically ready to use at the beginning. But it's only JS concept, the pan gesture. But let's not talk about it much. Let's see the code. How do you implement it? This is the the example which is missing some styling, etc., but it's basic for it to work. Do you see that, or should it make bigger? A little bigger, right? It's okay? Great. So you import pan-responder and animate it straight from the React Native library without any further integration. And you create holders for the cart offset, but you also have to save the offset between the gestures, because without it, every time the user taps again, the cart would jump, and we don't want it, right? And here we have the helper value, helper function. We will use it later. And we init the pan responder for us. And first we ask for permissions, as I know this is mostly for iOS. And then when the gesture starts, we have to just set current value of the gesture. It's pretty easy. And when the gesture is end, we have to save our offset to the save offset for later and set our current value for 0, because this is not moving right now. And basically, you then add the stored offset and current value and use it in transform, and that's pretty much it. But what about the result? Actually, mainly it would work smoothly. But I tested it in the situation that I added the listener to the gesture, so every time the user moves its finger, there is generated a new array of random numbers, so I will load the JS thread. And when JS is loaded, the application smoothness drops dramatically. But we told before that we have two ways of doing this. And we have the native approach, which is reanimated library, and pan gesture handler, which is part of React Native gesture handler library. You have to do additional integration for that, so it might be some, I don't know, wall for you to start working with it, but it's not that bad. Let's look at the code again. You import it from the React Native gesture handler and React Native reanimated, but it's more about the React Native gesture handler. It's the important part here. We have to import also a bunch of helpers for us, because you can't use that animated values in straightforward if-else condition in JS. So we have separate functions for them, and I believe it might be easier for you if you use some functional technology before, but it's not that bad. You, again, create values for you to keep the current offset and current gesture state, because we don't have the access to these methods. For example, on move or on terminate, we have to check it manually. And every time event happens, we emit the event and save the offset to our values. And then we check here if a gesture is actually happening right now, and the flag wasn't set yet, and we didn't set the previous offset before. We do it right now, so we restore the value we were counting from. And we track current gesture, and when the gesture is end, we store the offset to the value. And as well, we use it in the translation. So it seems to be more complicated, but the result is much, much better. This is the same test. The JS thread is fully loaded, yet the animation and gesture happens in native, and it can be smooth. It is right that because of how the both libraries work. When you do it in JS approach, every time user moves its finger, it's like asking the native, hey, Did he move? Yes, he did move. So do this and that. And when you create it in native approach, you create a bunch of, I don't know, instructions for the native. You push them to the native and not to worry about them anymore. So you don't have to do this back and forth communication. So, okay, we have animation and gestures and this fancy floating button covered. But we also have to open somehow the product details. And how do we do that? Again, dilemma. And this is kind of tricky because there are several libraries for the navigation in React Native. And none of them is implemented in the React Native itself. But one is easier to implement because it's JS, and the other is native, and it has a lot of steps to integrate that. But let's start again with the JS approach. It has a lot of pros in the case, because it's much easier to implement, trust me. And it has really good documentation, while the native library documentation is very, very poor. And it's easy to style that, because you create every screen in JS, so you have full control under it. But also it has some flaws, but we will come back to that. Let's see, how do we implement navigation? We actually import our screens. We use the helper create stack navigator from the React navigation. It will be different for example, bottom tab navigator. And we create the object with our screens. We pass some additional options, for example, initial screen. And we register component, create app container, which is our navigation container. So it doesn't change much in the flow of the application itself. But it has one major problem. As you can see, I create pop-up over pop-up over pop-up over pop-up, etc. And where you are navigating, you can see the JS drops in there. Why does it happen? It happens because the React navigation works in that way that it gets all of your screens, creates one native container for them, and packs all the screens in the container and manages them in JS. Which means all navigation happens in JS, so it can be interrupted by other JS tasks. Also, the native can't help you because it receives one mystery box instead of a bunch of screens which can be managed or suspended, right? And there's one more problem with that approach, because this library was created for JS developers to be as easy to use as possible. So also it mimics some gestures in JS, which usually would be native, but the native gestures aren't disabled at the time. So when you create such navigation, for example, on iOS and do that back swipe gesture, there are sometimes conflicts because the mobile doesn't know which to execute, and it ends up in weird ways, really. But once again, we have an option to use native, which has pros and cons, because it doesn't have such problems, for example, with efficiency as JS, and with that doubled gestures as JS, but it's much difficult to implement it, because the documentation has, I don't know, about 8 steps in native to do it. And the documentation is very old and poor. But once you go through it, I believe this code is actually more friendly to use. Let's take a look. This time, we don't use this app register component as we used before, and this is the default for the React Native. We are changing a few native files, so actually we register every screen separately. And then our root component is in here. We add listener to the app launched event, and we are setting the root of our application in native. And the effect? Both of threads are totally smooth because the native optimization can work in here.
and it helps us a lot. So the question is it worth to use native every time? I would say it depends on the context. If it should move or if it shouldn't. Well, the thing is that our customer is also a human being, and you also want him to be as happy as possible. So it's time for your expertise to choose the best option available, as user-friendly as possible, but as fast to implement as possible. And sometimes you don't need an excavator, sometimes the spoon is enough. So for small projects, probably JS library is quicker to implement, easier and easier for your colleagues to work with you. But sometimes when you are afraid that your application will grow, it's worth to put, for example, 1 day for integration, but to use native. The beauty of React Native is that you have a choice every time. Also, keep yourself posted, because if one library was most suitable for the moment, it doesn't mean it won't change in a month or so. For example, I know that React navigation is changing a lot recently. And for example, it is possible that soon the efficiency won't be against it, right? And last but the most important one, I guess, don't trust the internet and don't trust the single speaker. If you read articles on Twitter, etc., you can find a lot of information about the technologies. And I believe, yeah, maybe Dan Abramov knows what he is writing. But don't get fixed on the one tool after reading one article. Compare them, play with them. Maybe you will find some border cases, and I'm sure you will learn a lot, which will be cool for you. That's the end from me, but I have a surprise for you, because the post store is real, and I create a repository when you can buy lasers and sleeping bananas, etc. And in there, on the branches, you have all the libraries I mentioned today, as well with the test that I told you about. So the animation test and the navigation test for both of the libraries. So you can check it out and let me know your results. Warning, for now it's only for iOS, but I hope to fix it soon. Thank you.